Matt, you have been working on
Yes.
some stuff with some zero drop. So why don't you just give us a picture into what you feel like are the big things that people start to talk about when it comes to drop and kind of some of your thoughts on it, and tell people what you're up to in terms of your dissertation work.
So just so everybody knows, in case I look really absent-minded right now, or I don't respond to your emails in a timely manner, I've got my proposal, the first part of my dissertation coming up here in the middle of November. I'll be taking my comprehensive exams, which gets to determine whether I keep going or not. No pressure in this PhD. But my proposal and research is on masters athletes, masters runners, specifically looking at why Achilles tendinopathy is so common. And so one of the things I've been looking at is foot strike, heel drop in shoes, and all those factors together. So, talking about this right now is exactly what I'm looking at, doing a deep dive. And so, my experience has been when a lot of people talk about drop in shoes, a lot of times there's also a conversation about foot strike. And we've talked about that before. But I think the biggest thing to start out with is just because you're in a different drop of a shoe does not always mean it's going to change your foot strike. It might. Different people are responders or not, but don't just assume that's going to happen. Yeah, am I going too far, Nathan?
Nope, I think that's great. And just to make sure we're all following you, when you say that it's not going to change, the typical thought pattern was that as you lowered your drop, like if you went to a zero drop shoe,
right,
the thought was you're going to change your strike pattern to a more mid to 4 foot strike. And if you went to a higher drop, like a 12 millimeter drop, the idea was you'd go to heel strike, and they're finding that not to be the case. That's what you're saying.
Right. There are plenty of people that will do that. Right. And so the biggest concern there is if you suddenly switch to a shoe, which, as with all shoes, if you're changing something significant, please transition slowly. But don't assume you're going to change that. There are plenty of people running in zero drop shoes, whether it's max or minimal cushion, that are still heel striking really heavily. So again, even though people connect these with foot strikes, there is in some people a connection, but not everyone, right? And so depending on how you land or change your landing will also place different stresses in different areas. So while we are going to talk about foot strike, we don't want you to be married to this concept when it comes to drop.
And do you have an idea of how prevalent that it happens for people to change? Is like, 60% of people switch their foot strike, or 50% or 90%, or is that not quite known?
That's not quite known. That's a great question. There are some studies that have kind of looked at the periphery of that, but we're not sure about who's a responder and who's not. And it has to do more with
responder, you mean
whether they change their foot strike or not.
Yeah.
And it has to do with how flexible their the movement patterns that somebody uses are. Some people are really rigid, like no matter what environment you put them in, they're going to use the same movement pattern. If we're talking about foot strike, it means they're going to use the same foot strike no matter what. Other people are going to adapt. And so there's going to be, people adapters and non-adapters. And so we don't know the exact numbers. We just know that some people do and some people don't. So don't be married to that. We are going to talk about it, but don't be married to it.
So just generally in this topic as well, let's talk about what we know about load shifting between different types of drops. So if we go from kind of the extremes that we see, I think obviously zero drop is one end of the spectrum. I think we've seen 14 millimeter drop in some women's shoes. I think the Nimbus Light 2 was a 14 millimeter drop. So what do we know about biomechanical loading models and what they're showing about what's getting loaded? And do those loading patterns change based on drop?
They certainly do, because the heel drop, the first thing it's going to affect is the position of your foot, and specifically the position of your talocrural joint, or specifically in English, the ankle joint right here. So that's going to directly affect calves, right? How much of the length of your calf's going to use. With a higher drop shoe, you're not going to have to use as much calf length. You're going to be in a little bit more what's called plantar flex position, right? So you don't have to get as much of this to go. So people with shorter calves can get away with a higher drop and run and not maybe not have as many issues, where somebody, if they have a lower drop shoe, that puts you into more ankle dorsiflexion, which requires the calves to get stretched a little bit. So if you're going to do that, you better have good mobility and good strength of your calves, because again, lower drop shoes will typically stress the ankle and your calves more. And by stress, I mean you're going to have to make sure you have good mobility and strength there. Whereas a higher drop shoe is more likely to put a little bit more stress through the knee and hip.
Yeah,
usually.
Great. David, do you have anything to add there? Or that seemed pretty straightforward. It's hard to read you today because we can't see your face.
You're doing the whole episode like that, huh?
It's also been partially intentional.
I can tell. It's like you're like frozen completely.
Yeah, for the listeners, I've just been like sitting still for like the last probably 10 minutes.
It hasn't been 10. I mean, I know I talk a lot. It hasn't been
I'm just
10
kidding.
minutes. I thought I was doing better.
I'm kidding. No, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, that does seem to be the case. For me personally, my foot striking habits don't really change, but what I do notice, let's say I go for a 10-mile run and maybe my legs start to just kind of like have some normal levels of fatigue at like maybe 7 miles or so. What I do find is that transition from the midfoot to forefoot, when I'm in a higher drop shoe, I almost just kind of like send my foot forward and like pitch it and roll it. And then like, the load gets shifted more to those like hips, hamstrings, knees type musculature.
Yep.
I notice that goes away in the lower drop shoes. More specifically, my Topos, my Ultras, and my Newtons. And I wanted to specifically bring up Newton in general.
Yeah, it's a great
because
they're a
of
really
how
good
unique
example.
they are.
Yeah.
So the shoe might be whatever 2, 3, 4 millimeter drop. They don't really ever go above that. But their lugs are almost always the same height or millimeter difference as that drop. So it's basically like a dynamic zero drop in some ways.
Yeah, they do not factor in the lugs into their measurements.
It almost
So-
seems like a negative drop shoe, depending on where you're landing too, especially with those. Especially as a more of a heel striker in those, I definitely get some negative drop feeling in that.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, just from a musculature loading standpoint, because we talk about like, okay, maybe you're having some Achilles tendinopathy like symptoms. Maybe you switch to a higher drop shoe, shift yourself into a little bit more plantar flexion. Maybe that unloads it. Well, for me, I get proximal hamstring things every once in a while. I switch to a lower drop shoe. I actually feel way better.
Yeah.
So they've actually been working for me pretty well. And I'm kind of like a mid to rear foot striker. I'm not a hard heel striker, but I definitely do land on the rear foot. So I just notice it in that midfoot to forefoot transition a little bit on how that moves through the shoe.
Totally.
And so I noticed that ground contact time in the forefoot might be a little bit higher when I'm in a lower drop shoe.
Yep.
Specifically in the forefoot compared to the heel. Like I was kind of just like, you know?
Yep.
But the ground contact's longer up front, whereas if I'm in a higher drop shoe, it seems like it's a little bit longer in the rear foot and midfoot.
Yep.
Besides that, I mean, they both work well for me. I run in both. I mean, this is a 12. Wait, whoops, my bad. I totally thought I was holding a Wave Rider in my left hand. I was not looking down. My bad. But this is a 12. This is a 0. I love them both.
Yeah.
They're both two of my go-to daily trainers.
I think what David is touching on nicely is remembering, as we always say, that shoes are tools, right? And so, yeah, different shoes are going to place different stresses in different parts of your body. It's not necessarily going to reduce the stress. So if you're having injury issues that follow you no matter what, it's probably not the shoe. It's probably you needing to work on your strength, your ability to shock absorb. But yeah, changing shoes will also change where things are stressed, right? So lower drop shoe is going to require more work from the foot and ankle. Higher drop shoe for a lot of people is going to require more work from the knee and hip. And so you can use that, and we encourage you.
I just want to say, too, like, you best believe I'm working those eccentric hamstrings and glute work. And I'm not just switching shoes. I'm constantly working on things. So we try to practice what we preach. And
it's good to offload things, but also please work on it.
Yeah, that's a good summary of kind of there's just changes and differences between like zero, and we're going to try to kind of stick on some zero drop stuff a little bit and kind of what happens there. But just talking about, Matt, you mentioned the amount of range that your Achilles is going to have to handle and the amount of loading both likely increase with the use of a zero drop shoe. One more topic that we should talk about broadly here is the fact that all of these measurements for drop are measured statically, but we don't just put shoes on a table and that's how they act. We run in them when we load them. So let's talk about the difference between static measurement of a shoe and dynamic use of a shoe, considering things like decompression of foam, rockers, like how does a 4mm rockered shoe compared to a 4mm non-rockered shoe? Why don't we jump into some of those things?
That's a perfect set of questions. Which one should we start with?
Whatever.
Let's do foam compression because I get too excited about rockers. You know me, especially heel devils.
Let's do foam compression then.
So the other two will tell you the same thing as well. And we know this, right? Just because a shoe has a static measurement does not mean it's going to feel like it has the drop that's listed, right? Because foam doesn't just stay there. It's not static. It compresses, right? It moves. It's dynamic because we are dynamic. We're loading it. Depending on how soft or firm the foam is will determine how much it deforms. And depending on where you land will change the drop. So if you're a heavy heel striker like myself, in a high drop soft shoe, if you land really hard in the heel, once you compress that foam, the drop isn't going to feel as high because once you land, it's relatively, with the compression, is going to make the shoe feel like a lower drop shoe versus something like, this, where the foam's just a teeny bit firmer. If I land in the heel, it might feel either a little bit negative drop, it might feel a little bit more neutral. And the same thing happens if you land in the forefoot. If you land in the forefoot in a shoe that's really soft, the foam's going to compress and it's going to feel like it has some drop, right? Even in a zero drop shoe. It's going to go either way. So know that these things vary depending on foam, geometry, on your foot strike, all kinds of stuff. So the number is a good guide, but don't get stuck on that. What do you two think?
I'm not sure I could have said it better myself, to be honest. That was pretty good.
Ooh.
I'm getting better at being straight to the point, right? I got this time limit. I set a timer every time I start talking.
He's growing. It's all a growing process together.
Yeah.
No, I remember. Yeah. I remember my first and I think this will transition us into some rocker conversation. Yeah. But I remember my first time wearing the Skechers Speed TRL, and like that trail shoe. So the Hyperburst, it was pretty soft, and there wasn't so much of it that it was like firmer, like some of the higher stack Hyperburst stuff. There wasn't that much of it, so it felt softer. And then the whole shoe is just one big rocker. And I remember standing in that and feeling like my toes were up in the air and my heels were down on the ground. And I think rocker, depending on where it's placed, is either going to make a shoe feel like it has a higher drop or like it has a lower drop. And so if there's a shoe that has a rocker that is really biased towards the heel, like it's an extension of the bevel all the way through the midfoot and forward, that could be something that is going to make you feel like you are going to have a little bit of a lower drop to it. Whereas something like, and David was actually holding it up before, but something like the Glide Ride 2, which doesn't really have that much of a heel rocker, but the forefoot rocker is super pronounced, that can make a shoe that may only have a 5mm drop or something feel a little bit higher than it is. So what do you guys think about rockers? Would you guys agree with that? Do you think it's a little different?
I think some of it too just does depend on your own individual biomechanics and foot strike. I think I notice with sharp rockers in the heel, I am a little bit sensitive when it's a real sharp heel bevel. I feel like I get pitched forward quickly a little bit faster than I would like to. And I think part of that too is because I don't really land super far back anyways. And I'm almost like landing on the apex where it's kind of just like a, Yeah. So I'd almost prefer it to be a little less.
Yep.
And then have a little bit more up front.
Yep.
Or some concoction of the other way around just to balance the feel out. But no, I mean, I agree with most of that.
Cool. Matt, what do you think? Rockers and drop, dynamic drop.
I think the heel bevels, if they're heel and bevels and toe spring, if done well, can actually take some pressure off. We do know that rockered soles, if done correctly, reduce some of the work at the foot and ankle. And just the same way, I mean, the Altra Paradigm, which we'll talk about in a second, despite being a zero drop shoe, I really didn't have a lot of issues with it because the toe spring and is done so well, and the forefoot flexibility is done so well. So if those things take some pressure off the ankle, and especially how much your calves have to work. So if it's done well, you may not notice the drop as much, right? Just because your calves aren't having to work necessarily as hard, right? You don't have to use as much motion, so it can make a huge difference. So that's why we encourage you not to go, oh, this is a zero drop shoe. It's like, well, yeah, but what else is going on?
Right. And we typically write about that in our reviews that, hey, this is listed as an 8mm drop shoe, felt more like a blank, because we try to express kind of how the interaction between the foam and the geometry is going to make it feel.
Right.
DJ's just getting me.
Yeah, he's
just kidding.
He's actually sleeping. That's what's been interesting is I feel like
doing so good.
With a lot of the shoes that we've reviewed recently, I feel like I haven't noticed the drop as much because I think companies are doing a better job at integrating bevels in their toe spring and heel bevels. And I'm like, yeah, I know this is an 8mm drop shoe or 10mm drop shoe, but I'm really not noticing this that much.
Not super clunky or something.
Better at that. Yeah, unless it's
totally.
Yeah, I think traditionally, if it wasn't done well, that high drop shoe would almost feel really slappy.
Yeah,
clunky. And then the lower drop shoe would almost feel like way too much like a racing flat, where you're like this. I feel like I should be like taking off in this thing, and I'm not. Whereas now I feel like they're starting to dial in that geometry a little bit better. And it's just a lot smoother. Like you can take it out the box and just go run in it, and it'll be a comfortable ride. It's not something you have to adapt to as much.
Right.
Obviously, with any new piece of footwear, you have to adapt, but.
Right. So in the zero drop world, there are companies that stake their whole philosophy and make their living on creating zero drop shoes. And there are plenty of people who fall in the camp that zero drop is the best thing for the runner. And just knowing that there's truly nuance to that, and we speak to that kind of stuff all the time, but what are the benefits of a zero drop shoe for a runner?
Before we start talking
where does that
about
come
this,
from?
Yeah, before we start talking about this, I want to clarify again that shoes are tools. So there is no such thing as a best shoe. There are tools that are going to work better for different people. Some people are going to work super well in a zero drop shoe. Other people, not so much. So when it does come to some benefits that you might see with the zero drop shoe is that you're going to get a lot more work at your foot and ankle. A lot, not all of them, but a lot of these zero drop shoes tend to be a little bit lower stacked. So you might get a little bit better ground feel, a little bit better proprioception. Again, that's not always the case. And you're going to work, if you do it the right way, on strengthening a lot of the, your calf muscles. You're going to take load away from structures like your knee and hip. So it's just changing things.
Yeah. I think that there might be, I agree there, Matt. I think some of the processing for people who are pushing zero drop is that if you're a responder to a zero drop and you shift your foot towards a mid to forefoot, you might land with your foot a little bit more underneath you. You might have, we talked about this in a Science Friday recently, you might have a little bit more of a vertical tibia when you land. That can actually improve your efficiency when you run. Mm-hmm. That can decrease some of the stresses that may lead to stress-related injury, like bone stress injuries in the tibia and stuff. So I could see where there's the philosophy where, zero drop allows you to allow the ankle to do the work that it needs to do, because actually when they do biomechanical analysis of healthy runners, the calf is doing most of the work. I mean, that's just like running is a very calf heavy thing when it comes to like overall use. Obviously there's more. The quad is absorbing tons of shock. There's propulsion through hamstring, swing phase, deceleration. Like there's tons of it. Right. The calf is a very large portion of what they're finding. And I think that the philosophy that a lot of people might ascribe to who sit pretty starkly in the zero drop camp is that it allows you to use the muscles that you're supposed to use and hopefully decrease some of the high impact in forces and impact loading rates is the philosophy. Whether or not that happens all the time, we know that it doesn't for everybody. But I think that's where some people sit in pretty heavily. And there might be some true benefit to having a shoe like this to be able to use if you fall into the category of people who have a lot of bone stress related injuries.
It should be noted, by the way, that when most of these companies are going beyond the zero drop, they're usually talking about like more foot shaped shoes and some other factors as well as when they talk about what's more natural, like allowing you to spread your toes out a little bit more. So there are some also other factors as well that they talk about. We're just talking about zero drop at the moment, but totally agree with you. The calf, by the way, repeatedly has been shown to be one of, if not the most important propulsive muscle during running gait.
Yeah.
I will say too, and this is more anecdotal, but across every company with zero drop footwear, I find my body almost relies more on intrinsic musculature for shock absorption than the shoe itself. I don't slam the ground as hard. I notice my foot strikes, my landing, my perceived ground reaction force, or just the literal initial contact and loading response of me landing on the ground feels much softer.
Yeah.
In terms of like if you listen to someone running and you hear like a bop, 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 I notice my landing's much quieter in those types of footwear.
That's what alpha flies sound like when they run by you. Seriously, when I was running my marathon, I knew when I was getting passed by someone wearing an alpha fly. It was like so
squish,
loud.
Squish.
It's like king, clap, 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 clap.
That does go slightly off topic, but that does go into the fact that, just because you have a more cushioned shoe does not mean you have more protection, because you're usually going to hit the ground harder. So
this is actually,
I will say too, like even in like the Topo ST4, I mean, what was the stack height on that? Like 16?
16. Yeah. I think that's right.
That's like, like that's basically a flat. Like that's like nothing.
Yeah.
Well, an old school
and
flat
like
now.
I did like 8 to 10 mile runs, and like even with how little like midsole was on there, my foot strike was softer in that than it would have been in, I don't know, something that had like 30.
Yeah.
Like a Bondi or something.
Yep, 16 millimeter for the ST4. Just confirming that.
My memory still works.
Solid.